Hello everybody, this is Ashton here from FitBigStrong.com and welcome to the 11th episode of the FitBigStrong podcast. Today is going to be a very interesting video and audio because I'm coming out of the closet. If that statement is making you think, Ashton, why are you coming out as homosexual on a podcast? And why is it your 11th episode? I'm not actually gay. I filmed my last podcast inside my closet because there was so much noise pollution that I needed to ensure that the quality was good. And because of that, there was no video. But now, as you can see, if you're watching the video version, we've got like a bit of like a studio set up, which is really cool. It's still got some improvements to do. I like the visual aspect, and that's slowly going to improve as I add cool things and stuff like that. The biggest concern though is the noise. So this is a very open room and I'm in like the corner, right? So I'm next to one big window and then directly in front of me is a really big window and then I have like a cupboard. So it's just bouncing echo, and so I'm really worried that the audio is not going to sound as good as last time. Because last time, like, look, when you're literally inside a closet, you've got no echo because all your clothes are just absorbing the noise. And so the audio quality will be good, but then like I want to make this a video podcast as well. So I'm in the works of some noise, noise dampening strategies. So one of them I was thinking about doing was putting so behind me, this is like on like a stand, right? Getting two of those and then putting stuff on there so that there's less echo, and then figuring out a way to manage these windows. That's a bit off topic because today we're here to talk about recovery, and it's kind of all about recovery, but not in the traditional sense. Like this podcast specifically, like this episode, we're not going to be talking about different recovery modalities like ice and like running and stuff like that. Really, what this podcast is about, which I wrote down so I don't forget this. We're going to really define recovery in the context of resistance training. Like, what does it actually mean? What is it that we're recovering from? Like in the context of resistance training. So, for example, like specific parts of our body take different levels of damage. So, what is it that we are damaging, and what is it that we're going to recover from? And then what the ideal recovery environment looks like, just as like a general overview. So really, this is kind of potentially going to be part one of how it is that we recover and why. And then next episode, after you've kind of had some ideas, we're going to break down the details as to how to maximize recovery. If this is something you're interested in learning. So, also disclaimer, if you hear noises, it is not a man in my basement. It is the birds outside and maybe like a truck driving past. So I'm still working on the audio. Be patient with me, please. Hopefully the info accounts for it. Okay, so let's define recovery. So after a bout of stimulus or hard training, to return to the same levels of performance, our body needs to repair the many systems which basically inflicted the damage or that fatigue cost. So that's what recovery is. So for example, like when we do bicep curls, we develop micro tears within the muscle fiber itself. And this needs to fully heal for the body to perform again. So really, recovery is, for me, how I define it, is the body healing the damaged systems to perform again. And ideally, in recovery, because we're interested in performance, we're going to recover beyond that level of performance to perform even more. So the micro tears result in hypertrophy. So as an example. Okay, what are we recovering from? Well, firstly, there is a shit ton of modalities to consider. And keep in mind, recovery is just the homeostasis, like the returning to homeostasis or beyond homeostasis for that particular system. And each system will vary in their recovery times. and also the total stress they can handle. Some systems can just take more of a beating. Some systems take less of a beating but recover really quickly. So you just got to think about that as well as we progress. Okay, so in resistance training, what systems are we trying to recover? Well, in no particular order, this is the kind of modalities you need to consider. We need to consider like muscle micro tears and chemical damage, tendon and ligament micro tears. You've also got like systemic fatigue, which is like that feeling of being messed up and just like, kind of like, we're going to break that down. I'm not going to go on to a rant about systemic fatigue just yet. And then we've got neural fatigue in specific movements. So that's like, a particular way of lifting is particularly weak, for example. And then you've got like psychological fatigue, which is like motivation and your ability to exert hard forces. Because that's a genuine fact. It's not that because you're just being a pussy, maybe you are just being a pussy, but a lot of the times there's genuine fatigue that is corresponded with hard training in resistance training. And so for your psychology, taking a break can further enhance your performance if it's not diagnosed as you're not being a pussy. So, all right. So, disclaimer, another disclaimer. Ooh. You're allowed to disagree with me on the order of what I think I'm about to talk about. So, for example, I'm about to break down the different speeds at which different systems heal and kind of how they get fatigued. You're allowed to disagree with me with the order. That's totally fine, especially the psychological one. But this is just based on my personal experience as an athlete and with my clients. And it's also rooted in some understanding of exercise science with my sport and exercise science degree I'm graduating from. So just let me know what you disagree with, though. I'm very interested because I think that would be a fruitful discussion. Okay, let's break down these recovery times. What's the fastest, Ashton? In my opinion, that's the muscle micro tears and chemical disruptions. So this is like a very localized fatigue. And this is usually expressed just in like lower performance and kind of like a localized soreness and disruption. So, muscle micro tears and chemical disruptions occur when you're doing bicep curls. Your biceps get really burnt and they go, and you go home, they're a little bit disrupted after the session. You wake up the next day, they're sore for like a day or 2 days, and then they heal. So that's kind of what we're talking about, is that local fatigue within the muscle. So anytime you train, you're going to get micro tears and chemical disruption within the muscle. Chemical disruption is because, like every time you train, the body uses energy systems, and those byproducts can disrupt the muscle structures. You've got hydrogen ions just bouncing around everywhere. It's like, they might do something. And that's just a rant about that. I don't know why I decided to go on that particular tangent, but I thought it was interesting, so I did it. Recovery time, this is like an average. Generally 1 to 4 days in most cases. Sometimes you can recover quicker if you're exceptionally weak and small like me. Sometimes it takes longer if you've got like a back of Ronnie Coleman. If you don't know who Ronnie Coleman is, oh my God, search him up. If you got a back like that, Jesus Christ, man, I don't know how long that's going to take to recover. It's like 2 people on a back, So, like in seriousness, like the size of the muscle group will have an effect on the recovery time. So the quads, when you do a hard leg session, you've taxed way more muscle fibers. So you've disrupted way more muscle fibers, and there's more stuff to recover. And it's also in a really mechanically advantaged position. So you can put a lot of load and force through the quads in a really safe manner. So it's built to push hard and take a lot of damage. And then, but you've got like the side delts, for example. If you're lifting your arms, it's like, it's quite disadvantaged. Like this isn't a strong position. So the muscle fibers aren't really exposed to insane loads. And it's just smaller and weaker. So like, for example, you could train side delts one day, do 3 sets. The next day be ready to do another set, like 3 sets. Whereas quads, Some people train at like 1.5 times a week. So you have a hard quad session, and then you have like a supplementary quad session where it's only like 4 sets. So yeah, it all depends. Okay, so the next one, which I think is the second fastest to heal, is neural fatigue. What is neural fatigue? So this is when a specific movement pattern performs unusually poor compared to other movements. And you have to feel really stiff in that kind of movement. So let's give an example. When I was really trying to push my deadlift about 1.5 years ago, and really trying to see what my recovery capacity was, all my sessions felt great, right? Up until one session where my deadlift, I couldn't even break the floor with warm-up weight. Like like this weight moves like easy, and it didn't break. And I'm like, this feels strange. And I felt fresh, and I wasn't sore, and all my other lifts continued to progress. That's a neural fatigue problem. That's the specific movement itself has been overworked, and the neurology is not allowing me to exert the forces. So that's neural fatigue. And in powerlifting, where we get very specific, there's a lot more, it's much more of a potential problem. Because, where our muscles are recovered, but we can't generate the drive within that movement pattern, that just means we need to rest a little longer. Because, the goal of powerlifting is to drive force and strength through a specific movement pattern. And if the muscles are healed, but we need another day to stay, just another day of recovery to get fresh again, then that's what we got to do. But in bodybuilding, it isn't actually that much of a problem. Because as our muscles recover, but a movement doesn't recover, we can just use a different movement to target the muscle. So for example, if you're doing bench press, you do 3 sets of 10, and then 3 days later you're considering doing 3 sets of 10, but neurally you're just too fatigued, but the muscle feels fine. You can just do dumbbell press or machine press. You can just find a different movement pattern. That's totally cool. So, and look, sometimes the neural recovery matches the muscle recovery, so it is 1-to-1. Each session, you're not oh, which one is it? It's the same, but not all of the time. And so that's why it's second, because though it can match, there have been cases where it extends beyond, and that's more common than not. So there you go. Okay, so systemic fatigue. What is systemic fatigue? Well, this is when all performance in the gym suffers. Often you get low motivation in the gym, and the body just feels kind of full of stress, And here's a way to think about this. As local fatigue needs to be dealt with, it requires the resources of the whole body. So damage in one area, the body pulls resources from elsewhere to fix that damaged area. And the body only has so many resources, and those resources need to rest and replenish. And so when you begin to constantly pull from the reservoir, so to speak, so think about it as like a dam, right? And the dam is always dripping out. If it doesn't rain, or so to speak, if you don't let that system stop, then the dam will just continue to flow down, and eventually no one's getting water, and the whole village died, or they're getting water imported from the local city at 5 times market value. Where was I going with this? I decided to go for a rant, and I've lost my train of thought. Well, the idea is that we use so much of these resources, and the whole body suffers because there's nothing left. And so that's what systemic fatigue is, where we train hard. The muscles can feel good, the neurology can feel good, but we just don't have the energy or the resources. Or everything feels good, and then everything hits a wall because you've what's called overreached in training, which means you've carried so much fatigue. So that's kind of what, you can't, and in practically what this means is you can't train every bodily system as hard as possible. You can't, especially when you get stronger. When you're a beginner, look, you're a different kettle of fish. You're weak and you grow no matter what. Like, there's been research showing that, like, beginners have grown on low protein intakes, like, below recommendations. So they're a different kettle of fish. But, like, once you get strong enough and you're kind of intermediate, you know, like, you can't maximally grow your quads and your back and your chest and your biceps. Like, you can't do that. You know, you eventually need to put some things on the back burner so your whole body resources are more free. So think about that. You know, and to continue the discussion on systemic fatigue, obviously, as mentioned before, all performance decreases. And even if you're neurally recovered, the body runs into a reservoir. But really the interesting point here is other life factors add to this systemic fatigue problem, you know, because like such as stress, right? Like if you increase your stress, your body is pulling resources from elsewhere. You know, for example, like if you're doing like 50,000 steps a day, you know, each step is like, it's not really that bad, but you've done 50,000 of them. And so there's an example, like that might cause some wear and tear, even though small, and then the body has to heal that wear and tear instead of healing your biceps. So that's something else to consider. But I'm not telling you to be sedentary, by the way. I'm about to discuss that later. But systemic fatigue can take like a week to heal. It's the overarching fatigue. And so often the best method is a deload. And you're like, Ashton, what's a deload? You have to listen to the end of the podcast to find out what a deload is, my friend. All right. So tendon and ligament micro tears. Ooh, that sounds scary. Lucky last. Well, maybe not. So these kind of structures in the body, they're not very well innervated with blood vessels. So in other words, like the biceps, you know, or like muscle requires a lot of oxygen. It's very active and also requires a lot of junk to get rid of, right? And so there needs to be a lot of blood flow. With tendons and ligaments, there's not that much blood flow because it just doesn't need to be. Because they don't receive high blood flow, they get less resources on average. And so they just take longer to recover. You know, and there are cases where people have felt really strong, have been fully recovered in the muscle department, very motivated to train, but still torn a bicep. It's like, why? Because the tendons and ligaments take the longest to recover. And the biggest concern, they're also poorly innervated with neurons. And so you don't feel pain in them very much. So you could be on like the verge of a pec tear and have like no idea. And so, look, recovery with tendons can require like a full active rest phase. And so, isn't that kind of scary that you can feel awesome, be in the best shape of your life, and be on like the verge of like tearing your pec? That's scary, isn't it? And so it's important that we be proactive with muscles and tendons. No, not muscles, with tendons and ligaments. And so we need to often program active rest phases. And look, I'll break down what these different phases are to ensure that you have like a good idea. So don't worry about that. Okay, well, I mentioned psychological fatigue before. What is that? You know, this one is a little bit more complicated. You know, some days you just don't feel like training, which is like a small indicator of psychological fatigue. Generally, as systemic fatigue increases, your motivation and your mental ability to push during training also decreases. And sometimes you just need like more than a deload. So even after you deload, you're still like, oh, I can't imagine training hard for another 4 weeks before another deload. And so you might just need to do an active rest phase. So in short, like psychological fatigue, which is that feeling of, I don't want to train, or like training, you just feel gross thinking about it, and you feel angry that you have to show up to the gym, and you know you can't exert yourself mentally, even though your muscles are fine, and you just don't fit. So I don't want to eat. You know, like probably not. I mean, it depends on how old you are and you're training. You know, if you're trying to get your 5-year-old to Mr. Olympia, then that's how you might respond when you give it chicken and rice. God, I lost my rant again. Yeah, so in short, psychological fatigue can take like a week to 2 weeks to recover from. But it just depends on variables, such as, like, say, how long your training block length is, or how long you're accumulating. The training intensity. So if you're always pushing to failure, God, like, good luck. It depends on those variables. But generally, the harder you go for longer periods of time, generally the less you want to train and push hard. That's kind of like the general rule. Okay, so summary from quickest to slowest. The quickest to heal is muscle damage through micro tears and chemical disruptions. Then we have neural fatigue in specific movements. Then we have systemic fatigue, so that feeling of being messed up. And then we have tendon and ligament micro tears, which is the very last. And then psychological fatigue kind of falls between all of them. So that's something and that's why it's difficult. Like, do you diagnose as, I just don't want to train hard, or like you're genuinely fucking hating training, and the thought of training, you just makes you want to punch your coach in the face. Like, if that's how you feel, Jesus Christ, man, like, take a break. It's okay. Unless it's your job, even then, like, figure something out. But, like, that's just kind of why it's hard to put them in a category. So, Ashton, what is the ideal recovery environment for a resistance trainee who truly wants to max out their recovery potential? What's my life going to look like? Well, you need sufficient sleep, at least 8 hours plus. Generally 8 to 9 for most people, if you really want to maximize your recovery. Like, fundamentally, sleep, like, to touch on the neurological fatigue, like, I'm sure you've heard, if you're trying to study, then you want to get a good night's sleep, because the neurons kind of reorganize and solidify that knowledge. Same thing happens with resistance training. We learn how to perform movements in an ideal way for those specific muscle groups. And so we want to ensure that we develop that and perhaps recover that. And so that's one reason why sleep is very important. Plus, we get a lot of really anabolic hormones while we sleep. And so that's going to help drive up recovery on all systems as well. Sufficient calories and protein. So these are like straight up raw building blocks. Like imagine trying to build a house, and your team can take 2 truckloads of bricks a day to build the house, and you only show up with 1 because the other guy, I don't know, maybe he just decided to quit, and so now you've only got half the resources. You're going to build a house much slower, or the house you build is going to be smaller in total size than what it could be. And so it's important to have sufficient calories. If you're really trying to maximize recovery, at least maintenance. And, depending on what phase you're in, whether you'll have to cut or bulk, ensuring that you're not cutting too quickly. And ensuring that your bulk is large enough so that you can actually have resources to build muscle. And with protein, as long as you're in that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram range, you're pretty good. And so low stress, like we mentioned before with systemic fatigue, that high stress will take away from your total recovery capacity. And so if you really want to maximize your life, you will live as low stress as possible, not because just so you can recover more, fundamentally. So we don't want to be sedentary, but we don't want to be too active. So anywhere between like 7,000 to 20,000 steps a day is like a solid range. Because, as we walk, we increase blood flow. And that's going to place resources around our body and to where we want to heal the areas. But every step we take is using resources. And so, eventually, like walking to a point increases recovery because we increase blood flow. But then eventually that effect can be maximized, and any more steps after that we just take away from our recovery because we're using resources and potentially damaging those structures. Like, honestly, as long as you're not like running around all day, and as long as you're not sitting in an office all day, your activity levels are probably fine. But I feel like it's important to mention because some people really want the details. And so I just gave you the details. So that's very cool. And it's also important to program recovery. So in the form of light sessions, rest days, deloads, and then like active rest phases. Let's actually break down those. So a light session is basically a super easy session, It's generally below the threshold for stimulating results, because anything that's going to stimulate results is probably going to have fatigue, but we don't want that. And it's designed to kind of reduce all kinds of fatigue, a light session. And it does this by supplying blood flow to the structures of the body. And that's recovery enhancing, like we mentioned before. But we also have to consider that it can also be a useful session for technique. And so you can program technique sessions which directly make you stronger while also improving the recovery. So they are a useful training modality, especially for strength and power athletes. So a rest day is basically a complete abstain from training, like we're not going to train that day at all. And a deload is generally like a week of these light sessions. And this has the advantage of really tackling systemic fatigue quite a lot. Because systemic fatigue takes so long, we really need to drop that fatigue. And it'll take a week. And so we just use light sessions because we don't want to gain fatigue while we're trying to reduce fatigue. You get what I'm saying? So an active rest phase is basically no training for like 2 weeks. And this, why would you not train for 2 weeks? Well, this is like full healing of joints and connective tissue. Obviously, assuming you haven't like torn your bicep already. It's a full psychological break, and it actually really resensitizes your body for gains. And so, I'm not telling you to do them like once every month. That's ridiculous, because why would you do that? They're useful in the context of like, you've just done 3 really, really hard blocks of training and you got to pull back because you're about to do a competition and you want to be fresh so you can really prepare for the competition. Or you do it after a competition where you've just spent all this mental time just fixated on this one thing. And so that's kind of the applications. And yes, no, I didn't talk about all the different recovery modalities in this podcast, but I broke down the fundamentals of recovery. And so if you want me to kind of look at the trends and perhaps different ways of enhancing recovery, assuming it's legal, we can't really talk about other stuff. But if that's something you guys are interested in, let me know, because that's been the episode 11 on recovery. I'm now going to go train, and I haven't had breakfast yet, so I'll enjoy that. Anyways, catch you guys later.